Just call you up. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Just to say to you that we have 3 participants in the room and our guest lecturer. And I'll start by just introducing myself very briefly. My name is Sheila Norden, and I've spent the last 16 years working in the charity sector, mainly in the area of tax reform and regulation and everything to do with the Charities Act and the lobbying on that, lobbying for tax reform to benefit charities, and also very involved in the fundraising, the development of the guiding principles for fundraising. And then as of last year, we merged the organisation I worked for, which was called Irish Charities Tax Reform Group, with Fundraising Ireland to form a new charity called Charities Institute Ireland to meet the needs of charities in the next 10 years. And I took early retirement then and handed over to a new CEO. So I've had 1 year of almost being retired. I'm still finishing up some things. And I'd just like to introduce you to our guest lecturer. We're very pleased to have Jordan Campbell with us this morning. And I'll let Jordan tell you a bit about herself.
Hi there. My name is Jordan Campbell, as Sheila said, and I worked for 6 years as the grants director at the Ireland Funds. So I have experience grant making and building relationships with a large number of charities and of evaluating proposals from about 1,000 non-profit groups each year. I'm working in the fundraising side now, so I've kind of worn 2 different hats, if you like, both from the grant making side and the fundraising side. But I'm going to talk to you about building relationships with funders and also how to write compelling applications.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to just, the focus this morning is on, I suppose I'm going to do an introduction and overview of the governance of fundraising. So I'm really focusing on governance of fundraising this morning rather than fundraising per se. The main sources of funding that are out there, I'm going to touch on that largely on the kind of government grant side, but also just an indication of philanthropies. But as you can gather, Jordan is better able to talk about that than I am. Then we'll go both between us, we'll talk about understanding the fundraising relationship. And then Jordan will give that from the perspective of somebody who has been grant making. She's now on the other side of the table, so she's now making grant applications, so she knows what it's like from both sides. And then we're going to talk about improving how and I think Jordan is best placed for that because she has been dealing with grants for, as she said, for the last 6 years, and probably longer than that in a previous role. And then I'm going to come back in then on compliance with the fundraising guidance. And again, I'm focusing on the governance, what is the responsibility of the trustees, rather than the fundraisers, though I will touch on that as well. So that's what we're going to cover this morning. And we're planning that we will break after the item 3 there, where we talk about the relationships, before we get into the grant applications. And we'll have the break at that stage. So those of you who are live streaming, you will be able to email in any questions you have, and we will then address those questions after the break. Okay? So I hope that's clear. And we both of us try to, if there are questions in the room here, because we have people we can interact with, we will repeat the questions so that you will understand the answers maybe. Okay, so I want to start off with a kind of looking at the broad picture about the governance of fundraising. And actually, it's something you don't very often hear about. Right? You tend to hear about governance codes. You tend to hear about, I'm sure as finance people, you hear a lot about the charity SORP and the reporting requirements for charities. But it's very rare that you hear too much about fundraising other than good practice in fundraising. But in terms of governance, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And the first thing I would say is, who's responsible for fundraising? And very often you ask that question, people say, well, it's the fundraiser in the organisation. We've hired somebody to come in. No. The prime responsibility for resourcing the charity or the organisation is the board. The board is responsible for the strategic direction of an organisation, for ensuring that it is achieving and delivering on its mission, and for resourcing the plan that they develop in order to achieve its mission. And board members, in my experience, tend to sort of think that's something you leave to the fundraising department if you have a separate fundraising department within your organisation, or to the volunteers. That's the kind of thing you get volunteers in to do. But if I get one point across this morning, it is about the responsibility of the board. And that is something we really do need to address in Ireland. So what are the responsibilities? And the first thing is that they have to take full responsibility for resourcing the charity to achieve its overall purposes. Right? So you, as you're sitting around a board table or you're advising a board, you must say to them they are responsible. That's not something by all means you've got staff to work with you or volunteers to work with you, but it must be led by the board. And it's very important that the board members and that the board itself sets the ethos and the values within which all fundraising takes place. And in my experience, you'll often go onto websites and there'll be great words about the ethos and the culture of an organisation and what they believe in and whatever. But then I ask the question, do they live it out in practice? Right? So, I would be fairly sure that on kind of recent controversies over the last number of years by charities, if you were to go back to their websites and look at what they said they did, and then look at what actually happened. So it's the board members' responsibility to set the culture. And I know you're going to have a session on culture of boards as part of your diploma. But that ethos and values and if you do, how the beneficiaries of your services are portrayed, for example, in images and messages in your communications, that's very important, right? We all know that fundraising has to pull at the heartstrings. It's emotional. People give from a feeling or a connection. But that doesn't mean you can, use images in a way that would be demeaning for the people that you are working for. So they're the kind of things that a board really needs to give thought to and ensure that whatever you do, not just in your fundraising, in everything that you do, that there is a clear ethos and your values are seen in action rather than just on the page. It's up to the board to develop. Now, that's not saying on their own. You may have somebody, if you're lucky to have somebody like Jordan working with you, to develop and approving an appropriate fundraising strategy. And that strategy needs to be designed to get you the resources that you need in order to deliver your overall purpose. And I'm going to bang on about this quite a lot because it's just, in my experience, nobody likes fundraising, nobody likes asking somebody for money. But in my view, if the board members are not prepared to go out and ask for money for the cause, you cannot ask staff members to go out and ask for money for the cause. And a CEO can't ask their staff to go out and ask for money for the cause if they themselves are not prepared to stand on the street and explain the cause. If you don't believe in it, you won't be able to convince people to give you money. And that has to start at the top. And it also means, and it's something Jordan and I talk about, is that board members themselves, you're not saying they have to be necessarily out on the street, but they need to give you access to their networks, to their contacts, so that you can ask effectively. So it's important that the board takes that responsibility in terms of resourcing the charity. Usually, in my experience, boards take great responsibility for how the money is spent, right? And finance people are very good on that. But it's how the money is raised is really a key part of the responsibility. And in doing that, there must be an appropriate balance between different sources of fundraising income. So between when I talk about institutional, that would be like government grants, or service level agreements that you might enter into with government departments versus fundraising from the public. But also that institutional would include like the Ireland funds or philanthropic funders, because they usually have grant application type procedures. But on the other side, the public fundraising, and you need to have a balance. The last thing you want to do is be totally reliant on government funding, because your independence depends on your sources of of fundraising. And in my role, we used to get government funding, we had membership fees, but we always said we would never have more than 1/3 government, or 1/3 of members, so that all your eggs are not in one basket. So when the cutbacks come, and they did come, that you weren't just closed down overnight. So this is a role and a responsibility of boards to ensure that. Here we go. And to achieve this, I would say that you have to have and give thought to having fundraising expertise on the board. Now, that can be people with a marketing, communications type background, but people who understand what's involved in developing relationships with funders and ensuring that that relationship is nurtured and looked after, and that the messages also with the public, that you're getting messages out to the public, that they will want to support you. And then it comes back to what I was saying about the ethos and values, that you've got to ensure that your fundraising communications are aligned with the overall messaging of the organisation and its ethos and values. And a good example of this is, you often see the pictures of children with kwashiorkor or malnutrition, very sad pictures on the television. It draws at the heartstrings. But if you're a rights-based international NGO, you have to question, is that the right image you want to portray? Now, what you tend to see is they might show the before and after. And then you have a kid running around and sort of saying, this is what your money will do. It will bring somebody from this situation to this. But the focus is on the positive. And there is actually a code of practice for overseas aid charities in terms of the kind of messages as imaging that you should use and not use in terms of looking at the rights of the people that you are working with. It's up to the board to ensure that their organisation adopts best practice standards in fundraising, and that they hold the executive or the staff accountable for adhering to these standards at all times. Now, I'm going to come back to this later in relation to the guidelines from the CRA is the Charities Regulatory Authority, which is our charity commission, if you like, and then Charities Institute Ireland have taken over responsibility. They've developed codes of practice for actual fundraisers. But the guidelines from the CRA are directed at the board and board responsibilities, whereas the CII codes of practice translate that into detailed codes for doing different types of fundraising. So one is geared towards the trustees, the other is geared towards the staff doing the actual, or the volunteers doing the actual fundraising. So that's the responsibility. It's up to the board to have the plan, to ensure that the resources are there to deliver on that plan, and to support, to make sure that the fundraising is done in an ethical way and that it matches your values and your ethos, and that you are adopting best practice. So there's a monitoring role there that they have to ensure that is happening. And then the other one, which you tend, and I find this, I'm going to be cheeky here about finance people. Finance people are always saying, what do they want the money for in the fundraising department, and how are they going to spend it? You've got to acknowledge that it costs money to raise money, okay? And now, that doesn't mean you need to ensure transparency in relation to that, to the real cost of fundraising. When you hear people saying that all of your euro is going to the cause, the question in my mind is, how come? How is that possible? Because if somebody gives me €1 and says, I want all of that to go to the cause, I'll give it back and say, you better bring it yourself. Because if you give it to me, I have to report to you, but I also have to go and bank it. I have to log it. I have to issue receipts. I have to ensure that money is spent well. So I might have to go on evaluation visits, or the CEO or the program staff have got to go out and look at what's going on the ground. That costs money. Right? So, but there's also the actual investment in fundraising. And, there's always a tension between finance and fundraising. In any senior management team in a charity that I've ever met, the fundraisers will say that the finance people don't understand them, and the finance people will say that lot would just spend the money, like they want to invest in this. That's a natural tension, and it's an important one, and it should be there at the board as well. But you've got to invest in fundraising. You've got to invest in developing relationships. By all means, what's the return on investment? That's a very important, question. But the notion that any charity can, that all the money will go, if they're doing that, they're subsidizing the administration from money from somewhere else. So this is something you must be very conscious of, and then be transparent. It actually costs. The public actually understand this. They do know that to run an organisation, it's reasonable to spend 25% of the euro to make sure that the money is spent well. Okay, so there's always a fear of this, and then you get people with pie charts saying, oh, we spent 95% of everything. And my question always is, well, are you monitoring properly? How can you do that? So I think that's something that boards need to acknowledge, be upfront about, and decide what is our policy in relation to this, and what do we consider a good return on investment. Okay? And interestingly, just in terms of when I'm saying about the having skills on the board, there was this was Persuasion Republic did a survey, a sample in 2017 of 50 charities with income over $1 million. Okay, so significant sized charities. Almost 95% of them had no board fundraising experience on the board. I guarantee you that those 94% of charities will have probably a legal, most definitely will have finance, but when it comes to fundraising and communications, you'll probably find that they don't have the expertise. And of the 5.6%, they're the numbers, and they're actual numbers, like it's 8 or 9, it's not percentage there. So like there was 9 people in it, in the disability sector with fundraising experience on boards. So it sort of shows you that this is an area that is neglected, and it's an increasingly important area, I would argue, in terms of governance of charities. Okay, so just in terms of where do you go for the funding, and I'm going to focus here now on the kind of areas that, if you look at the latest information that's available, comes from an organisation which is itself, it's actually not a charity, it's an NGO. And what they do is they gather, I don't know if you've come across it, Benefax. It's a great resource, right, in terms of the really accurate information, because the information is based on the accounts produced by the charities. Now, that means that the information is as good as the accounts of the charities. And we already know that there's a relatively small proportion of charities in Ireland that report to the SORP standard, which means that there's there's a lot of unknowns. And you look at this, but if you take based on the 2015 returns, and these returns are got from the CRO, right? And so it doesn't include the unincorporated charities because they don't produce audited accounts. They will be submitting these to the CRA, and then they will be able to include that. So Benefax is a resource that you should use frequently, I would suggest, for accurate, independent information. Of the 10.9 billion of funding in the sector in 2015, 2 billion was described as government grants. Government service fees, which would have been service level agreements with different departments, primarily you'll see probably with the HSE, 3.3 billion. So 5.3 billion of the 10.9 is coming from government sources. You then have earned income. That would be something like when I said ICTR had membership fees, that would be considered earned income. Or you might have some kind of charity shop or whatever. That would be earned income. 1.9 billion was reported. Fundraising and donations, 0.7 billion, so 700 million. But interestingly, other 3 billion. And that means that it's all grouped together somehow and they don't know what it is. Now, I think over time, that will be unpacked because the regulator will be requiring more detail than the CRO does. And as ultimately the regulator will be requiring charities to use the charity SORP, and then that will break it out in more detail. But there's 3 billion that we don't know about where it's coming. You can probably guess that some of it's coming from government, some of it may be coming from earned income, some of it's coming from donations. But I would say possibly, again, from government sources, quite a significant. But I can't prove that. That's just, the figures you have there are the best that are available. But that's a significant amount of money, income, going into the charity sector. Or I should say NGO sector, because Benefax looks at NGOs in general rather than only the charity sector. So it's bigger than just the charity. So where are those funding sources? Well, when I talk about institutional funders, we tend to think in terms of government departments and their agencies. I noticed that there's somebody online who works with Pubble. Pubble is an agency that works with both European and national government funding, and it works on behalf of a number of different departments, grant making and overseeing contracts for service as well. The HSE is an agency of government, Department of Health. You also then have philanthropies like the Ireland Funds, like the Iris O'Brien Foundation, like the JP McManus Foundation. So you have a number of trusts and foundations, and Jordan will talk a bit more of that because she understands that world more than I do. And then you have corporate funders. And some companies have their own foundations. Accenture has a foundation, for example. Apple Green, I think, the petrol station, they have a foundation. And then you have other corporates who do what is called CSR, corporate social responsibility. So it's a sort of, how do we work with the communities within which we work? So that again can be a source of support, sometimes financial, sometimes volunteer, depending on the organization. But the likes of an Intel or those would also operate CSR policies, and there are awards every year for CSR. And then in terms of public fundraising, now I'm just sort of listing here the types of public fundraising that you'll see. Committed giving or direct debits, you sometimes hear this called as charity mugging, which I don't like, because this is actually a very important form of giving. This is where people agree to sign up to paying a monthly direct debit to a charity of their choice. And the advantage of that is that you actually have a relationship with the donor. In my giving, I give it in this way, because I want to know to have regular contact with the charity that I've chosen. I choose it carefully, and then I make sure that I give more than 250 a year so that they can get the tax back. So that my donation of 250 is worth another 112 euro because of the tax associated that they can claim on my donation. So committed givers think about their giving, but not only that, you have direct contact. You have their email, you can write to them, or you have their address depending on how they want their communications. So it's a very important form of fundraising. And it gets a lot of bad press. People tend not to like it. And boards tend not to like it. They say, no, I don't like that, because when I go down the street, I don't like to be stopped on the street. If it's done well, it is a very valuable type of fundraising. So it's not something that should be just written off. Event fundraising, we're all familiar with this. Like sometimes it's marathon, the ladies' marathon, or the Dublin City Marathon, and people do it for specific charities. You might have events like people going off on trekking events, or people running a quiz, a pub quiz. These are all this type of where it's one-off events. Now, the difference between that is you don't know who's giving to you. You do on the day maybe, or your volunteer does, but you've no record of individuals, and you've no way of contacting them again. One of the most important, that's why I really focus on the committed giving. It's something every organisation should think about, because when there was all the controversies about charities, those charities that had their donors, a donor database, were able to immediately go out and say, if you have any concerns, here's our accounts, here's how we spent the money last year, please phone up, the CEO will be happy to talk to you, etc., etc. It was easy, so those donors stay with them. Event fundraising just went through the floor. People who were relying on event fundraising were tearing their hair out, because suddenly, the kind of auctions that they used to have at, I think, suddenly nobody wanted to do any of that, and so it's more risky in that sense. But you need all of it. I'm not saying it's one or other. Community fundraising, this would be where you go at the flag days or the, communities raising funds for a particular cause. And again, developing relationships with volunteers in the particular communities that they will actually fundraise on your behalf. Lotteries and raffles is another one there's different law covering that, but it's still, you do see that people running draws or raffles. They're very strict law around that and how much you can offer, etc. And then the kind of normal fundraising appeals, you see them at this time of year a lot, where there's an appeal for Yemen or there might be just an appeal for the Laura Lynn Foundation at Christmas or whatever. And then cash collections, which would be your Flag Day or bucket collections. Okay, so if you're talking about kind of institutional funders on the one hand, and then the public fundraising, where you're actually interacting directly with the public, asking for support. Okay, I'm going to talk mainly about the statutory funders because I suppose that's where I have my own experience as somebody who got funding from government, and then talk a little bit about the developing relationships with fundraisers, and then I'm going to hand over to Jordan then to come in from her perspective as a funder in the past. In 2016, the HSE made of grants of less than 100,000, and I got this from their annual report. Okay, just looking up in the back of the annual report, they actually give a list of the organisations. It's well worth looking at annual reports to find out where money and who gets it. So 32, now they didn't list the 1,709 organisations, right? Just so that you know. But there are 1,709 organisations that between them got grants of less than 100,000, and the total for that was 32 million that was given out. Okay, and they would be grants in aid. Over 100,000, it was 3.9 billion. And you remember when I was talking back about the pie chart where I was showing, most of the, you tend to find the HSE is a very big funder in terms of government department. And a lot of that will be service level agreements, which we'll talk about shortly. The trend in all of it is moving away from grants to service level agreements. And in the HSE specifically, anything over 250,000 is a service level agreement. So you are in a contract to deliver specific services on behalf of the HSE to the client group. Okay? And then the responsibilities are set out on that, and we'll be going through what the differences are in that respect. Pobble, we have, I think, somebody online. They have 24 programs, and looking at their 2016 report, they gave out 428 million in 2016, and that's a mixture of government plus EU funding. Kind of local development partnerships, they would be, some of that would be EU funding, European Social Fund, European Regional Development Funds, and also government departments. They give it out on the Department of Rural and Community Affairs now. It keeps changing, but it was under Environment, it's now Community and Rural Affairs. But they also do it for the Department of, I think they might have some Department of Education. They certainly do it on behalf of the Department of Social Protection. So there's a whole lot of schemes out there that are managed by Pobble on behalf of different government departments. And the trend here, I think it's fair to say, is also towards moving from kind of grant agreements towards service level agreements. And this is all very much from the kind of value for money ethos, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, sort of saying, well, what are we getting for the money, and are we making the right decisions? And then Irish Aid, I thought, was another good example of a large one that gives out the Department of Foreign Affairs 386 million in 2016. That was bilateral aid, what they call bilateral country to country, rather than what, they also pay into the UN and various multilateral agencies. So that gives you, they'd be the key ones, but then you would also have, like Department of Education and Skills may have schemes that would be relevant, Employment Affairs and Social Protection, all of the CE schemes come under that. Rural and Community Affairs, Pobble tends to manage their grant funding. Justice and Equality will fund certain, Jordan, I'm not sure, do you get anything? Yeah, so Jordan now works for the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, so they would, Justice and Equality and 1 in 4, those kind of organisations may get support from the Department of Justice. Department of Children and Youth Affairs, Family Resource Centres, there'll be a lot of children-related organisations and the youth clubs, I think. Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, it used to be, had community in there, so, they would be probably more now on the housing associations, I think. Pia, you have some experience with, yeah. So, again, and then the Department of Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht, as you can imagine, that would be in those areas. So when you're looking, you need to kind of look broadly at who is likely to be funding what and what schemes, look it up on their websites. What schemes do they administer, or who administers them or manages them on their behalf? Is everybody okay for the moment in the room? If you have any questions online, just start noting them down in an email if there's anything that you need to gain. Okay, so in 2014, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform issued a circular to all government departments on the issue of grant funding or funding agencies or organisations. And in that, and I included this in the with your materials, so you will get a copy of that circular, because it's what you really need to read that, because that is the government policy on giving money to organisations. But the overall principle is that there should be transparency, accountability in the management of public money, in line with economy, efficiency and effectiveness. There is far more scrutiny now than there ever was on how government money is being spent. Is it being spent efficiently? Should we give it here rather than here? And that's value for money. And if you give it here, are we losing an opportunity here? So the notion that you always got money from the department or from some department and you had a good, that doesn't wash anymore. So you just need to be very aware of this. So that's why I think this circular is very important if you're looking at government funding for your organisation. There are 4 principles that apply. They're set out there. It's clarity. You need to be clear about what it is you're asking people to do. And governance. This is increasingly important. And I was on the board of actually Carmichael Centre, and you could really see where it used to be that the CEO could sign off on things. Now it's the board have to sign off on actual contracts and service level agreements. They actually ask for board members to sign off. And there's an increasing focus, and you can see why, because there have been some of the controversies, and I don't think that the controversies are, I don't believe everything I read in the paper, let's put it that way. But there have been failures in governance. And there are people, who may be on boards for a very long time, and you get comfortable, but you're not really doing the job you're supposed to be doing, which is actually leading and questioning and holding the executive to account. So there's a real focus on that from government. Actually, from all funders, I think it would be fair to say, wouldn't it? Yeah, I mean, equally, we got funding from the Ireland funds. They're very keen on looking at your governance and how it's going. Value for money. You'll hear this over and over again. Are we getting value for money? So if I spend the money here, is it better than giving it here? And you need to be able to demonstrate that as a board. And fairness. It's not because you kind of know the TD or the minister or whatever. It's can we stand over the decisions, or can you, as department, stand over the decisions you're made, and that's based on evidence? There's an increasing preference, as I said before, for service level agreements over block grants. And service level agreements actually specify what the outcomes are for the service users. And your job is to deliver on those outcomes. And if you don't, there's, the contract, you're in breach of contract and all that entails. So it's important to be aware that that's the way things are going. The default position, even where there are grants, is that payments are made on the basis of vouched expenditure. You don't get the grant in advance, right? And this is an issue for organisations because you have to have cash flow, And so, but you have to, you have to spend the money before you'll get the grant in. And Jordan and I were talking about this, and we were saying that, in the agreement, it will specify when you should get the money. In our experience, you've got to meet all the deadlines as the charity, and the government deadlines can slip, right? And that can be for very, good reasons, or like that there's they have to get the minister to sign off or whatever. But you always have to have money there. You can't think relying totally on this, because it will always, the time lag will be there. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It still applies, I think. And in this case, like I know I'm also chair another board where we make, it's loan finance we provide. And a lot of the leader programs that were out there, you had to spend the money before you could claim it. So we were providing bridging loans that helped them to get over that hump. So that's another thing to think about, like that there are organisations out there, the likes of Clan Credo and Community Finance Ireland. So maybe you need a short-term funding. It's worth looking at that, rather than being on the breadline, wondering how you can manage. Okay. Just in terms of grants, and this is set out in a way. I'm kind of summarising what's in the circular. So you have the full circular, but basically what they're saying about, how do they are saying to the department, you must prioritise the grants that show evidence of best outcomes for end users, not because you like the organisation or the CEO or whatever. No, can you demonstrate that there's evidence that this is a better outcome than putting the money in here? And that's, again, in terms of, I think Jordan will talk about this, making your grant application, you need to be able to cite evidence of your ability to deliver. Where there are competitive grants, and there are schemes where, with Pubble, I know like there's one for national networks and federations, and it's by competition. Applications go in, and then they assess them, and then they decide on who gets the grants. And again, from the Ireland funds, Jordan has dealt with this, where you have thousands of applications and a small number of grants to make, and having to decide between which one will we give it to. So what they look at is the projected outcomes, how realistic are they, efficiency of approach. Like, so they go, that's what you'll be measured on. How efficient are you compared to others who are competing with you? And again, evidence of effectiveness and prior performance. You've got to have a track record. Okay? They're not going to just trust you because you tell them you can do it. Can you demonstrate it? Can you give evidence? Can you get references to say, actually, we have a track record of delivery in this area, and you can rely on us. And from a department point of view, their decisions must be based on evidence, and the process must be, on my screen now, the process has to be documented is the word. That I don't know if you can see that. You might see it. Yeah, it's a bit out of line, but it's basically the department has to document the basis on which they gave the grants. And as you can imagine, freedom of information, etc. When people don't get a grant or whatever, they can make, find out. So that this is how grants are expected to be made. Compare that then with service level agreements. And within the document, they set out the general parameters. And in this is a contract between two organisations, so between the department and the funded body. So what's the role of the department will be set out, and what's the role of the charity or the organisation receiving the funding. There need to be clear, measurable outputs and a description of the desired outcome. Okay, the outputs are what you're delivering on, and then what are you trying to achieve in the longer term in terms of outcomes for the client group. Details of the funding arrangement, including the drawdown process. Now, this is where they set out, like, we will give you, the first drawdown will be at such and such a stage, and then on delivery of X, Y, Z, you will get the second drawdown. And this is where I'm saying you have to allow for slippage. You will have to meet the deadlines, right? And that'll be very important. But as I say, there can be a lag sometimes on the payment from the other side. And I just bear that in mind, as you need to have resources in place. That's where you use your reserves to kind of hold you through, or if necessary, perhaps borrow on a short term. It'll also set out the kind of review process, including the timing of the reviews, the methodology of them, of how the performance review will be conducted, and against the outputs and the outcomes. And, you know, again, like, for example, Pobble will have their own internal audit function. They will come out and audit at, you know, specified times, perhaps. That'll be all in the agreement, set out. And you need to be prepared for that and be able to deliver. You know, when somebody comes in and they want to see how things are going, you need to be able to deliver the information with the measurements, but it'll be specified what you're expected to do. So again, that's something a board needs to be, because this is a contract between your charity and the department, and you must oversee that this is being delivered on according to the timelines agreed, because otherwise you're putting the charity at risk. And then it will also specify what happens if you fail to deliver and what the procedures are, and that will include what's missing at the bottom there. That will include clawbacks, for example, of the money, or what steps will be taken in terms of how to deal with any failure to deliver. And again, I think it's fair to say that it tends to be skewed more, like the power lies with the funder more than with the funded, right? So while you might be able to sort of say, well, you haven't delivered on the grant by the date, I doubt there are very many charities out there who would be taking a department to court over that. Let's be realistic. So that's the point I was making earlier. So that's essentially grants. You know, it's about like evidence of outcomes, but here it's a contract for service. And like even when you're dealing with the SORP, you treat them differently. There's specific ways of dealing with service level agreements, even in how you account for it. And it's well worth looking that up for those of you who are not familiar with the SORP, to look that up on the sorp.org website. And then the kind of compliance and the terms and conditions. In terms of grants, again, I'm reiterating, you only get the payment on the vouched expenditure. You have to have the money up front to spend it, then you claim it back. It will be subject, if you haven't put in your reports by the agreed form, in the agreed format and by the agreed deadlines, you're not going to get the money. So that's extremely important, and a board should be on top of making sure that that is happening, that the reporting is being done. There needs to be timely submission. Usually they don't ask you for your audited accounts because everyone's year end is different. But once you have your audited accounts, they want it done in a timely fashion. They don't want it 2 years later, right? As soon as you have your audited accounts, you've submitted them to the CRO or to the CRA, you should be sending them into the department automatically, whether they ask for them or not. Right, and that's again building up the kind of trust and sense of credibility with your funder. And you know, sometimes they'll ask for audited accounts, but some of the smaller organisations, they may accept another format, but that will be up to the grant maker to decide what they will accept. The terms and conditions are legally binding, and failure to comply will have financial consequences. And as a board, that is extremely important from a fundraising. The board have to stand over this, because if you don't deliver, that will have financial consequences for the charity. So that's a risk that boards have to be very mindful of at all times. On the SLA side, payment is based on performance and achievement of agreed outputs and outcomes. And that's why it needs to be very clear about the measurable, because you need to be able to say, well, this is what we agreed to do, we have delivered, now we wish to draw down the funding. Equally, the department need to be clear so that they can look and say, yes, you have, or no, you haven't delivered. So you need to, when you're, sometimes people sort of go into the grant making or the agreement sort of saying, oh, well, we'll put this down and we'll put that down. Be very careful. This is what you are going to be held to account on, right? So be clear that you can deliver what you say you're delivering. Otherwise, you'll suffer. Again, it's subject to timely submission of reports. in the format at the agreed intervals, and they determine that, not you. Okay, so you need to make sure that you have them in your plan that these reports will be delivered. And again, the annual audited accounts to be given in a timely manner. And very often government departments will ask for specific information. One of the things that is a requirement is to list government grants by department. There's another circular about that. So, and not all charities comply with that. But so very often it'll be specified in your agreement what additional information, and you may have to ask your auditors, because they will want the auditors to sign off on it, to say, like, this is the additional information we have to, over and above a statutory audit. Okay? So it's something, again, to be mindful of. And again, the terms and conditions are legally binding, and they will have consequences, financial consequences if you don't. So that's something a board needs to be very much on top of, to make sure that, like, if you're getting 1/3 of your funding from government, you need to make sure that you are looking at the risks associated with that, and making sure, if there are problems, that you are actually communicating with the department that something's not working out. But then if you talk to people, the worst thing you do is try and hide. Okay? And then what I've done here is just list, because I mean, Jordan will talk to you from a philanthropic type of funder point of view, but just the ones that I'm familiar with, or the names I'm familiar with, but they all fund different things, and we'll come to that in a moment. But the Ireland Funds, the Community Foundation for Ireland, Iris O'Brien, which is Dennis O'Brien, that's his mother's name, he has set up a foundation in her name. JP McManus tends to fund a lot around the Limerick area. St Stephen's Green Trust, the Catherine Howard Foundation, Basis Point, these are ones I know of. The ones that are closed or are winding down, who are very large funders, Atlantic Philanthropies and the One Foundation. So the One Foundation is closed, and Atlantic Philanthropies are making their last grants, so there's no point in even thinking about them. And then the corporate philanthropy and CSR, I just gave some examples. Accenture, Applegreen, Musgrave have a foundation, Diageo, Guinness, Lidl, the banks, Davies, Tesco. Some of them are more corporate social responsibility, some have actual foundations. And then you find the big pharma companies tend to have certainly corporate social responsibility, if not some of them might have. You tend to find that with some of the multinationals, they may have their foundations in the US, but they may make grants, some grants in Ireland where they have factories or companies here. So again, as I said, I'll leave that to thing. So, this is, I suppose, developing relationship with funders. How do you do it? How do you develop a relationship with anyone? All right? Those in the room? Any ideas? I'm saying grant writing is fundraising, okay? And fundraising is about building relationships, okay? And you need to know your funder, okay? If you go to a nightclub tonight and you meet someone, you got to get to know them before you'll agree to go home with them or have a drink with them or whatever. And I suppose, what are the two, if I were to ask you, and I will ask you, those online and those here, write down just the two words that come to mind when you think of a good relationship. Just two words that you would sort of say are absolutely essential, fundamental. And you just note down that word there, Margaret, and Pio, and John, and is it Anne I have here? Clodagh, great. Just two words. I'll ask what the words are in the room, and then I'll give you the two words that I would put. And I'm pretty sure we're all going to be fairly on the same page. Clodagh, do you want to give me your? They can't hear you online. I'll repeat.
Trust and loyalty.
Trust and loyalty. John?
Trust and integrity.
Trust and integrity. Margaret?
Trust and openness.
Openness. Pio?
Trust and integrity.
Yeah, and I was just going to say trust and honesty, openness. We all, the first thing you need to do is trust someone. And the other thing is to be open. So we were talking about this over breakfast, and I was saying, if somebody walks up to you on the street and says, Sheila, you know, I'm in a bit of trouble and I need a few bob, and they give you a very plausible story and talk about like the children are at home and they're, you know, they've no food and I just need to get whatever. Do you hand over money immediately? You might. And I might give them, but I might give them €5. I'm not going to give them €5,000, right? But I might talk to them and see if I can get to know more. And then I might think, well, I'm not sure I want to just, I'm not sure about this story, but I actually am worried about homelessness, for instance, since it's very topical. So I might then start talking to people in the homeless area before I would want to give more. I might want to give. And a lot of people, I think, at the moment want to give to homeless, but where do we give? And who do we give it to that we will trust? None of us give money to people we don't know. Or if we do it out of a sort of guilt, and it'll be a small amount, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, and it salves your conscience or whatever. But if you actually think about giving serious money, and even the biggest funders don't, and actually the biggest funders, I always heard Chuck Feeney is the man behind the Atlantic Philanthropies, and he put 4.4 billion, I think, into his foundation, right? But I always remember, one of his staff saying, when they were giving out grants and making them, he said, it takes a lot of hard work to make $1 million. So to give $1 million, and he also said it is much harder to give well than to earn money. And that is true. So people who have money to give, they know how hard it is to earn that money, and they want to make sure that they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck. And you, as somebody looking for grants or funds from them, have got to convince them that they should give it to you and not to me. And that is your biggest, so you've got to know your funder. Not that you just do up one grant application and fire it out to everyone. No. You've got to actually know who you're talking to. So I've done some do's and don'ts, and then Jordan then is going to come up and talk from her experience of being on the other end of receiving thousands of grant applications, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think would be fair to say, of that. So you've got to establish a relationship. You've got to talk to the programme staff. So if you're applying to Pobble, for example, I shouldn't be picking on Pobble, or if you're applying to the HSE, look on their website, find out, usually they will give you, very often they run workshops to help you to understand what they will and won't fund for starters and what they expect. You need to be at those. Or if they don't have workshops, you need to be ringing up and saying, I just want to be clear. I know I've read this, but can you answer me questions here? But this is your way of getting to talk to the people involved, right? Because they don't know you and they don't have time to get to know you because they could be getting thousands of applications. So it's up to you to develop that relationship. You have to do your homework. What are the priority areas for the different funders? You'll find that each of those funders, whether they're government or whether they're philanthropic, they will have a special area of interest. I would say that the Ireland funds probably had the broadest, right, possible, so that they had over a number of different areas. But a lot of organisations, it's like we only focus on children, or we only focus on education. There is no point in putting in a homeless unless it's got an education angle to it. So you really need to do your homework in terms of, and as a board, that you need to check that your staff have done the homework in terms of, are these the priority areas? Because if your mission doesn't match the mission of they are equally focused on a mission. They are charities themselves. They have to have a purpose. So what's their purpose? Is there an alignment between your purpose and their purpose? So it's a bit like regulatory alignment, right? This is like funding alignment. It's in the news at the moment. So that's very important, and you really need to do your homework. Review documentation published by the funder. Go onto their website. Look at the annual reports. I mean, that's why I'm saying, like the HSE, I wonder how many people applying actually look and see who are they funding? Who's like you? Can you get advice from somebody who's already got funding? Charities help each other, not all in competition. They will talk to you about it. Is there information on the programme? If there are guidelines, get them and follow them, right? Do not ignore the guidelines to tell them what you want to tell them. They will tell you what they need to know, because if you're dealing with hundreds of applications, you will have certain criteria, and if they don't fit those criteria, they're going to go into the bin, because they don't have time to come back to you and say, no, you didn't go by the guidelines. That is that's a kind of a red flag. It's how to say, well, if you can't read the guidelines, how can I trust you to deliver on what you say you will? Okay, so they're fairly basic. Get to know the application process, including deadlines, the information required, and the formats that they use. Not that you'd like to put in, but that they use. So you can't have one document fits all. You have to tailor your application to the organisation. Follow the guidelines and propose. It's one thing reading them. Action speaks louder than words. You can read the guidelines and then go off and do your own thing. No, you really do have to follow the guidelines. And very often the guidelines will tell you to be brief. They don't want huge tomes, right? Be brief. And then if they want to ask you more detail, you might be invited in for an interview or whatever, but do what they tell you. And I'm saying give the funder all the information that they request, right? Keep it relevant and keep it focused. I think this is probably one of the biggest complaints I've heard from funders is that, oh my God, it's a wad of information. In the middle of it, there's probably a very good proposal, but we don't have the time to dig it out. You can include additional information that might support your thing, but put it in an appendix, right? And they might look at it when they're looking at you more seriously. You might get shortlisted and then they look at the appendix. But make sure that all the information that the funder wants is in the proposal in the format that they want. And then I put the don'ts. Don't promise more than you can successfully deliver. Don't, because you'll then end up with problems about you're not delivering, and then there are financial penalties for not delivering. And it shoots, your credibility will be shot. And remember, departments talk to each other, and there are networks out there. It's a small world in this. Word gets around. So, rather under-promise and over-deliver would be my advice. And then you'll be very popular with your funder. Don't pad out your application with irrelevant information. Don't make claims that you can't back up with evidence. And it needs to be objective evidence. Not, my friend told me. It's got to be, and this is coming back to, you'll see the relationship of this with the circular, where evidence-based decision-making on grant funding. So you've got to be the one providing the evidence. This is very important. Don't expect funders to know about your organisation, right? You have to be clear about what you do, why you do it, and your ability to deliver both efficiently and effectively. And this is where evidence is needed. Funders don't have time to get to know all the organisations out there, right? If you get on their funding list, you might start with a small grant, the Ireland funds. You start with a small grant, and then you then go maybe to another stage, and they get to know you a bit better, and then you go for the bigger one, right? But by then you have a track record with them, and they've watched you over a number of years, and they think, yeah, actually, this is worth investing in. But you've got to prove that. Don't underestimate the importance of your organisation being able to demonstrate good governance structures, and I've underlined practice. It's all very well, you could have everything up on your website and saying the code of governance and we're compliant and everything. They would be looking for evidence from, do you actually practice it? Basic. Go on to the Benefax website. Look up the organisation. Who's on the board? How long have they been on the board? 25 years? Don't touch. Right? So that, the evidence that there's that the board is rotating, that there's new blood coming onto the board. You have to have a mixture of experience and new blood. And it is a challenge, I know this. I mean, it is a challenge to get people to go on a voluntary board. But on the other hand, we tend always to rely on our own networks. Those charities that have actually advertised for board members have been amazed Even some of the ones that were in the news, like Rehab, when they advertised for board members at the height of the controversy, they got lots of applications in from people who believed in the organisation because the job they were doing was excellent and still is excellent. But they said, yeah, actually, I remember we had a conference and one guy stood up and he was kind of giving out about Rehab, and then he thought, actually, I'm just a hurler on the ditch. I need to put my name forward. And he went forward and he's on the board. So there are people out there who will get involved on a board. We tend to sort of ask our friends or ask friends of friends or somebody from that network. Consider there is an organisation board match that you can go and look for. But that's an example. The other thing they will look at on Benefax, and they can look this, and it will be also available on the regulator's website. Let's have a look at their accounts. Are these accounts transparent? So again, you need to demonstrate good governance. Are they signed up to the guiding principles for fundraising? The triple lock, as Charities Institute Ireland calls it. You have the governance code, the fundraising principles, and the SORP. That's your triple lock. That should be, and if you're not there yet, you should be at least on the journey to get there. And these are the kind of things that will help. But that's showing practice rather than just saying we're good at governance. And yeah, don't expect your funders to award your organisation funding because you're doing good. You very often hear people, but it's like that lot would never fund you. We're doing a great job in our community here, but they don't know that unless you can demonstrate it to them. So they won't just give you the money because you're trustworthy, Sheila. Sure, we know, yeah, you'll be grand. That tends to happen at a local level for a flag day. Right? So when I go along and I see Margaret collecting, I know Margaret for years and I'm very happy to give Margaret the money for a flag day. But that's not going to wash for somebody giving you a grant of 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000. So you need to prove it to them. So I'm going to hand over to Jordan, who's far more experienced from the other side of the table in relation to this. And then when we've this bit over, we'll then have a break. So keep those questions, jotting them down, okay?
Thanks, Sheila. Sheila and I met for breakfast this morning, and I was doing a fair bit of thinking about good relationships with grantees and the best case kind of scenario and some of the best examples of charities I'd worked with over the years. And I'm going to repeat back a lot of the things that Sheila said, but from my experience, that's accurate, and that's a really good picture that you've painted of what good organisations do when they want to build a relationship with the funder. The first thing that stands out is that they're very proactive, that they give you evidence that they've done their research, they know what your priorities are as a funder, that they've read your guidelines, they know what you're interested in, they know what you want to achieve as a foundation. And they're coming to you with all of that already in their mind. So they have some sense, they understand what your priorities are as a foundation, and they've also considered why their project or why their organization might be of interest to you as a funder. Some good examples that came in over the years were organizations that said, well, I know that your guidelines say that this particular area is of interest to you, say mental health, for example. We're a charity, we're doing this mental health work, we think this is really compelling because. And the organization that can say that has shown that they've taken the time to get to know what matters to us, but they're also considering how they fit into the picture of what we want to do and why they should be picked over another organization that may be doing similar work but may not be quite as good, quite as strong a fit. The organizations that we tend to build relationships with are the ones that really seek feedback. They're the ones that ask questions. They might have a new project that they haven't run before that they say, we think this might be a fit for you, but we're not sure. Or they might have applied for something completely off the wall, the application might be declined, but they're the organization that will lift the phone and say, can you tell us why this application wasn't successful? Or what can we do better? How do we really build our relationship with you? What more can we do? And those are the organizations that you can see are really taking the time. They want the money, obviously, we all do when we're working in fundraising. We want to get the money in, but it's more than that. They really want to work with you as a funder, and they're bending over backwards to say, we're open, we're transparent, but we're doing really great work. We're showing you the evidence of what we're doing, and we're making sure that everything we're putting to you is going to be good for your organization. The strongest charities that we worked with over the years are ones that not only meet the requirements. So you mentioned kind of reporting and the timetable, when organizations should be submitting their reports. Are they doing that? Are they meeting the requirements that are in the grant agreement or the service level agreement? Are they doing that well? You'd be amazed at the number of organizations that tend to take the money and run. So they get the grant in, and that's great, and there's a maybe a nice email or a phone call or something, but then you're chasing that organization to get their reports in. One of the things that was important to me in the Ireland funds was the proportionality of our reporting requirements. So I think it's honest to say that lots of funders are really, they may overburden charities on some occasions, and I think it makes more sense just to be open about that reporting for the sake of reporting, sometimes it can go a little bit too far. But that said, the funder has the money, they have the power, they get to call the shots on that. And when you're an organization that's trying to get that money in, meeting those requirements is just the first thing that you have to do. You know, like if you want the money again, if you want to maintain a relationship with that funder, you have to meet their deadlines. But beyond the meeting of their requirements, the organizations that I most enjoyed working with when I was in the Ireland funds were those that kind of went above and beyond that. So not only would they have their report in by the deadline, you didn't have to chase them, you didn't have to spend that time kind of getting the information that you needed from that organization, but they were the ones that might send you photos from a recent event, or they might send you an evaluation of a program that you had part funded, that they were really keen to keep you as up to date as possible, and there was never any chasing required. There's also a bit about acknowledging your funders and kind of recognizing what they've allowed your organization to do. So I remember making a grant to an organization one time, and I think it was a 50,000 commitment over a 2-year period. So it wasn't massive amounts of money, but it was enough to be a considerable sum. And it's not an amount that most charities would turn their nose up at. But we had to ask the organization to put our logo on their website, and we had to ask for some kind of formal acknowledgement from them that we had made this grant. So that's the kind of thing. It might not have been a requirement, and maybe we didn't think to ask it at the time, and maybe we should have. But the organization that automatically does it, or that automatically sends the thank you note, or that really goes out of their way to say, this funder has really made a difference to our organization, and here's what we've been able to do because of it. That makes the funder feel good. It gives them confidence that their investment in you was worthwhile, and it means that they're going to think of you first the next time that they're holding a funding round, because they'll say, that lot, they did what they said they were going to do, they acknowledged our funding, and we feel we have every confidence in their ability to manage our money well. And that's what you want to be remembered for, not, oh no, we had a really busy week and we've missed our funding deadline and you've had to chase us up for it, or it's pulling teeth to get receipts if receipts are required. You know, you want to be in the position where you're leading that relationship with your funder, because like Sheila was saying, you're telling them everything that they want to know, but beyond that, you're actually giving them that little bit extra. With a lot of funders, they want to make sure that they're achieving their own aims, and they can't really do that without good communication with their grantees. Because by me saying, okay, I've applied to the Ireland funds, I've got this grant, if I don't tell the Ireland funds that I've done what I've said I was going to do, how do they know that they're meeting their own objectives? So it's just one thing to bear in mind with your reporting, that yes, do the minimum, but then I think that extra mile really makes a big difference. I think that's key. I mean, I know I'm repeating a lot of the things that you said, Sheila, but
It'd be useful to talk about the kind of, I suppose, how you build the relationship. You know, in terms of, if you think of some examples from yourself now,
Yeah.
a new relationship, something.
Okay, so kind of starting from the beginning in the process of building the relationship. So Sheila was asking me to talk a little bit about building a relationship with funders. I'm working as a fundraiser now, so have started really building relationships from scratch. So just to kind of go through a little bit of what that process looks like. So in my current role, I suppose the first job that I did when I came in was to look to see where we were getting our funding, where similar organizations were getting funding, if we had approached any of those organizations before, but really mapping out what the funding for our area looked like. So who's funding in this space? Who do we think might fund? Why do we think they might be interested in what we have to offer? Going back to what I was saying about kind of being proactive, that research piece is very important. And when I started, there were a number of organizations that I thought, well, I don't know if they're going to be interested in what we do, but there's something in there that this sounds a little bit like us. This sounds a little bit like we can make a compelling case for support, but we don't know because we've never worked with them before. So for me, generally, it would start with a phone call or an email or just some kind of introduction to say, you know, listen, I understand you as an organization are interested in supporting this type of charity. Well, here's the work that we do. And this is why I think this is something that you might consider. Sometimes the answer is, well, we're not really interested in that space, you know, and it's much better to get that answer direct and to not waste their time or my own time in putting in an application for something that's not trying to shoehorn into their priorities when really it's not going to be a fit. I think it's better to have that conversation open from the beginning because you don't know what might be down the line. So kind of respecting what their priorities are now. If it's not what your organization is doing, that's fine. It could be in 3-5 years' time. You just don't know. Where it looks like there is an opportunity for you to work with an organization, you know, like Sheila was saying, attend workshops. That's becoming much more popular now. In the Ireland Funds, we would run a workshop every spring to say, okay, here's our application, here's everything that we're asking you to do, and here's how to make the strongest application possible. We would have, I think, about 300 people attend that each year. And it was great because it's not about trying to trick people or to weed organizations out of the running. It was trying to get every organization that was interested in applying the best shot possible of getting funding. Now, we always had many more applications than we could fund, and that's the reality for most funding bodies, that they would have way more things to consider than they would have resources to support. But the organizations that took the time to say, okay, well, we want to know what you want to know, and we want to know about your organization, who you're working with, why these are your priority areas, and ask the question, you know, is this something that you'll consider, or does this sound like something that you would look on favorably? A number of organizations are now doing that kind of roadshow around Ireland because, you know, from the point of view, you might get 60 calls in a week from organizations that are looking for funding. But if you can go out and meet them and talk to them and do the kind of workshop experience, you can reach more people. So more organizations will know what you're about as a funder and what you want to do. And you also give people the opportunity to ask you questions. So the Social Innovation Fund, I think, do roadshows now. Social Entrepreneurs Ireland do roadshows. There's a lot more funding bodies that say, listen, we want to be out there, we want to be in the communities, we want to know what's going on, we want to know what issues are, we want to know which organizations are taking on the kind of work that might appeal to us, and we want to be direct about the types of things we want to support and how people can get involved. So that's a really positive development in Ireland, and I think that's really in the last kind of 7 years, most. Yeah. Because, I mean, the funders for a long time were like the Wizard of Oz. So there was the men behind the curtain, but you wouldn't necessarily have that access and have that opportunity to talk with them face to face. So that openness, I think, is really encouraging. And certainly in my role fundraising now, I've taken advantage of that. With funders that were new to us, so once you get through the research piece, that initial kind of question and answers and seeing if there might be a fit there, then I would get to making an application. So doing a proposal or submitting an application to the organization. And again, Sheila, you emphasized giving the funder what they want to know. And I think it's very easy now that I'm on the fundraising side, I know that it's challenging because you know what you want money for and you have confidence in your organization to deliver, but having that lens only about your organization is not going to be what's going to sell it to them. So when I'm going through an application, it's reading it through first. It might be doing a few drafts of it. It might require a few phone calls to that funder to say, well, listen, on this section, I'm not really sure what kind of evidence you're looking for when in our needs statement, for example. You know, can we give some anecdotal feedback? You know, whatever the funder wants. So with many funders, I think the application and the first proposal, like that's the first kind of introduction that they have to you formally. So what you want to do is make sure that you can show that you've read their guidelines, that you understand what they're looking for, but also you're making the case of saying, well, actually, here's what's in it for you, or here's what we can do to be what do I want to say? Here's how we would be a good grantee for your organization. So it might be that you say, well, listen, I know that this is a particular priority area for you as a funder, but here's why we're the best, or here's why we think that we're a really good fit, or here's what we can offer you if it's a corporate, here's what we can do to make your organization look good. I think submitting that first proposal, you want to be able to say, okay, even if this isn't the thing that they fund, you want them to say, well, this organization has done their homework, they're run in a professional way, and they made a good case for support. So I have done, I think, about 18 funding proposals in my first 6 months. Most of them haven't been successful, so and that's normal. But where they aren't successful, I have always said, you know, is there a chance to get feedback? Often there's not. A funder might not have capacity to give you feedback, but where they do, there's so many valuable things that you can learn that build your institutional knowledge of that funder. So an example, in recent times, I had applied over the summer. It was one of the first applications I did to an American foundation that had an interest in Ireland in mental health and kind of clinical support. So counselling was something that really appealed to them. I put in an application and it was declined, and it took a 2-minute phone call for me to know that they only wanted work with minors. So I'd put in something for adults. They were only interested in young people. You know, I think I'd applied for something for kind of third level students or something like that. So maybe the 18 to 25, they wanted 16 to 18. And it was really clear. They didn't specify it in their guidelines, but that was what they wanted. And it took a 2-minute phone call for me to find that out. So the next time I do a submission to that funder, I'll be really specific to say, this is for 16 to 18-year-olds. Here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to deliver. So it requires a bit of time on your part when you're making the application, but generally it's worthwhile, and it'll build each year. You'll know so much more about the funders that you might want to work with and what they need and what you can do to make your application stand out. From there, I mean, I think, you know, the reporting is so important, you know, and, you know, you said, again, it's the meeting the requirements at a minimum, but it really is the going beyond that. There's an administrative burden to that, because you not only, like in my organization, I'll have to work with the people that deliver the programs. I'm not the content expert, but I need to make sure that they know, here's what I've said in the proposal that we're going to do, and let's make sure everything we report back to them is using that proposal, or the contract, if there's a contract after that. But generally the proposal could be the contract. So when we go back to them, we can say, okay, well, we said we would deliver, you know, 3 literacy kind of training courses for young people. Did we do it? How many people attended? You know, at a minimum, you want to make sure your outputs are either what you've said you were going to do, or if they're not, that you address that up front. Because sometimes you're not always going to meet targets, and you know, it's unrealistic to pretend that, you know, that it's always going to be possible. But if our targets are realistic, and we have a good reason why we haven't met them, most funders are open to that as well. It doesn't mean they're going to pull the funding. It doesn't mean they're not going to fund you again. But it does mean that they may want to have the conversation about what didn't work, or what weren't we aware of when we put in this proposal, what has changed. And in my experience, most funders are really open to that, So in the Ireland funds, you know, if we would get a call from someone saying, actually, we wanted to do whatever set of activities, but what we found is this isn't actually the need. That in our community, you know, we had this wrong, we misjudged this. Would you be open to allowing us to use the funding for a different purpose or for a different activity? And oftentimes the answer would be yes. If it wasn't anything wildly different, if the target audience was the same, and we had confidence that the outcomes were going to be what we wanted to see or something very close to it, there would be a bit of flexibility there. And I think what you were saying, Sheila, about that trust and that openness is once a funder feels that they have that with you, then you'll find a lot more flexibility and a lot more kind of willingness to adapt or to kind of, you know, to give a little bit as well as just kind of taking in the reports and everything else. Over the next year, a lot of those proposals, again, I said I put in 18 applications, all of those that weren't successful are going to be ones that I will attempt again, but taking on board any feedback that I have and also kind of taking the opportunity to say, okay, maybe this program isn't right for you, but what about this? Do you know, and to kind of keep plugging away, because the more a funder hears from you, one, they know what you're doing, they know what you're about, they have some sense of what your values are as an organization, that it might be simmering away in the background for a number of years in some cases. But if that relationship is positive, and if you're building on that every time there's a funding cycle or an application process, ultimately, I think that will be a fruitful kind of effort, and it is worthwhile. And oftentimes, as Sheila was saying, you know, this is a small country. So if a funder says, listen, this project really isn't for us, but you should talk to this person. Do you know, and it is a bit of an archaeological dig to find which funders are the right ones. You just start burrowing into information to see where you might look for support. But often it comes up in unexpected places. So I think for me, we got a grant in this week for 12,000 from an organization we had never worked with before. And it was one that I found just doing desk research. It was on Funding Point, which is a website from The Wheel, and it was on ActiveLink. And I said, it was one of those ones where he said, you know, I'm not sure this is quite right for us, but I'm going to take a bit of a chance, and I'm going to put in a proposal because I think this is something that might be of interest to them. They sent a representative there to have a chat with us. It just so happened that she was in touch the week that we launched our annual report. So I got to bring her in to say, you know, look, here's what we do. Here's our annual report. Here's our financial information. You know, here's everything that you might want to know about us. What else can we provide for you? And that person made a really glowing recommendation for us to get funding, and we did. So now over the next year, we have that money in. Now my job is to make sure that we do what we said we were going to do, but also to make them proud that that's something that they've decided to support. Because we won't be able to necessarily, like oftentimes if you get funding from an organization, you can't apply the following year. There might be a cooling off period before you're allowed to apply again. But I really want them to leave saying, this has been an excellent grantee to work with. They made us look good as a funder. You know, we might kind of give them a bit of love on our website or on social media and things like that. But we want them to say, you know, we would work with them again. And if over this period we can have them believe in our work and be proud that they've supported us, that will stand to us in the long term, I think. So the nice thing about having worked as a grant maker and moving into fundraising then is you realize how important those small things are. So again, it's that kind of sending them photographs, sending the handwritten letter to thank somebody that's supporting you for the first time. You know, you want them to say at the end of the day, that was worth it. I would do that again. And that's that.
It's worth saying just a little bit more about the collaboration that there is between philanthropies. You know, because funders meet.
Yeah.
And so sometimes they fund jointly. You might come up with something innovative. Yeah. That they might say, well, we don't want to do it on our own. Mm. Yeah, so I will, she was asking me to talk a little bit about collaboration amongst philanthropies themselves, so kind of co-funding arrangements, I think is a good way to look at that. So those happen both formally and informally. So sometimes you'll have a group of funders that will just like meet for a coffee and a chat and talk shop. So they might be talking about different grantees that they're working with, or have you seen these guys before? The work they're doing is amazing.
and it might pique the interest of one of their colleagues. So it could just be an informal thing that all of a sudden leads to a new contact for your organization. Sometimes it's also done on a formal basis. So I have recently joined the board of the St. Stephen's Green Trust, and they fund what they would call kind of unpopular causes, or causes that would find it difficult to raise money from other sources. So kind of prisoners, traveller projects, projects for migrants, those kinds of things. So the St. Stephen's Green Trust, like every single foundation in this country, has limited resources, and they want to have the most impact possible for any euro that they're putting into a project. So one of the ways that they work, and one of the things that I think is really interesting that they do, is they look to co-fund initiatives with other funders. So they would sit down. There's a project that they're funding with 2 other foundations at the minute, where they're all putting in, I think it's a modest enough sum, it's something around kind of the 6 grand, somebody might be putting in 10 grand or whatever, but they've all agreed that the project is compelling, that it's going to have a good impact, and they're all putting in part funding to make it happen. It means the risk to the funder is reduced because they're not having to put everything into the project themselves. They're not the only funder of it, that there's a few that are kind of sharing that load. But for the grantee, it means they can leverage support from more than one source. So some organizations may require you to have matching funding from other sources, which puts the burden on you, the applicant or the grantee, to find those other sources of funding. It might be through fundraised income, through events. It might be another funder that's interested, but you have to do that work yourselves. Other times it happens like that, on a formal basis, where 3 funders come together to say, listen, we can't take all of this on ourselves, but we want to make a contribution. A good example of a corporate philanthropy, I assume I can name names. Yeah, that is kind of, a corporate philanthropy that does this very well is the ESB, their kind of corporate giving program. Yeah, so they would have limited resources themselves, but they would be really open to co-funding initiatives with other funders, and they would look for that. So when I was working in the Ireland funds, there was a project that I was interested in supporting that we really wouldn't give them the full amount ourselves through our own grant round, but I made a phone call to ESB because we knew that they had an application pending there, and we split the cost. So they took on a portion of that as well. So that was great because both funders feel that they are maximizing the impact, and they're making sure these projects get funded, but they are bringing other funders into it. Do you know? And I think like that's a great opportunity when that happens. This summer in the organization I'm in now, we got an excellent grant. It was a multi-annual grant, and it was for core funding. So it's hard to get, yeah. But one of the things we put in our proposal was that we wanted to use their grant to get other sources of income or to leverage support from other sources. And we put that in the arrangement to say we want to spend, it was, I think, 10,000 a year on either our communications or on finding support from other sources. But what that meant was we could invest that money in maybe a public fundraising campaign that we were running, or we could use their funding to say to another prospective funder, actually, we've secured this amount, but the whole shebang of what we want to do is going to cost this amount. We have all this in the bank already. Would you consider supporting us with this amount? So what we found so far, that's pretty compelling because it's showing a funder that you've done your homework, that you're looking for other sources of funding, that you're not just expecting one funder to come along and support everything, but that you are conscious, what do I want to say? That you're conscious of what the funders need, but you are trying to make it as attractive as possible for them to support your work. And one of the things that does that, it's my opinion, but I think it tends to work, is when you can say, we're working with funder X, here's everything that we've been able to do with them, would you consider also joining in to kind of co-fund or support that work? And it's really hard to say no to that because all of a sudden, every euro you put in, it might be matched. Do you know what I mean? Or, you know, if you can say, well, listen, you'll give us 100 euro, but we already have another 2 guys willing to say the same thing. So it's a bit of playing funders off one another, but it's also being very smart about it, because most of us would love the opportunity to double or triple our money kind of thing if an option like that was there. Does that make sense? Is that a good, yeah?
Increasingly, government are doing the same.
Mm.
I mean, when I said about ICTR and then when we merged, we said 1/3 government, 1/3 philanthropy,
Mhm.
1/3 earned income. And over time, a plan to increase the earned income.
Yeah.
But I think governments are looking for that as well.
Yeah.
Especially when they're granting.
Yeah. So Sheila's saying that governments are also looking for shared funding or matched funding kind of opportunities, and often it's a requirement when you put in the application. I think for a lot of them as well that you have to show. Yeah. And again, even if an applicant isn't. Even if that's not required in your application, that's going to be evident in your accounts. So when people are going onto a site like Benefax, which is great, you can do a lot of research about an organization's funding and see how much are they actually earning. Do they charge for any of their services? What other funders are working with them? And there's a lot of that even if you aren't asked for it, probably if you're looking for funding, someone is looking at that information about you just to see and to look at how healthy your funding is, that you're not over-reliant on one particular funder, because if that funder pulled their money, what would happen then? So,
Yeah, I think on the other side of that is they don't want to see duplication.
yeah.
Same project being funded by, that
Yeah.
is anathema.
Yeah. So Sheila's saying that state funders in particular don't want to see duplication. So like the same project being double funded,
Yeah,
is that what you mean? Or
sometimes,
kind
and
of,
that's
yeah.
why, where people don't report where they got the money.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And that's why the lack of transparency, when we're talking about
Mhm.
trust and openness,
Mhm.
it needs to be clear where your funding comes from and how it's built up.
Yeah. So Sheila's saying that it's really important that it's clear where your funding comes from, and what was the other
Well,
thing?
you're not hiding
That-
it.
that you're
Don't
not
you
hiding
worry
it,
that
yeah.
If you just lump all the grants together,
Mm.
are we funding something that somebody else is funding?
Is funding, yeah. Well, that's it, and particularly if you're clear that kind of 1/3 of a project cost comes from the Ireland funds, 1/3 comes from ESB, and 1/3 comes from your general fundraising reserves. You know, it's pretty easy to show that and to give all the funders kind of confidence that that's how that project's managed, rather than the fact that they're all just throwing money into something and nobody's sure who's paying for what. So, but the new, like with SORP and with greater transparency and financial reporting, it's harder to do that now. I would say an organization would struggle to, yeah. So I've been given the T sign that we need to take a break and give everybody a break. So we will come back. How long do we take?
We've got 15 minutes.
About 15-minute break,
So we 10 to 12.
10 to 12.
And
Yeah.
then Jordan will come back about grants, and
Yeah.
then I'll come in at the end on the good practice funders.
Great. So what we're going to do, we'll take just about 15-minute break. We'll come back and I'm going to go through grant applications, just kind of the structure of them, everything that's involved in preparing them, and then Sheila will wrap us up for the day. So thanks very much.